Nearly every Broncos fan alive has heard of the saga of Elvis Dumervil and the fax machine. I mean, it is an embarrassing moment in the NFL and NFL history, and one that is joked about nearly every free agency period. And there were several mistakes that happened in this often ridiculed event. And if they could have changed some of those events, they could have saved the day. But there's one detail that nobody mentions in these what if scenarios, and it's a small mistake that could have kept Elvis in the Mile High City, even if all those other events played out just exactly the same. And losing a star player of Dumervil's caliber due to a fax machine really hurt. He was an incredible force off the edge, and he combined with Von Miller to create the doom and gloom team. And he had really had an interesting story to start his NFL career. I mean, Dumervil was an elite pass rusher in college, but he wasn't drafted until the 4th round. And that's because teams were worried about his height. And even though Elvis had 20 sacks and 22 tackles for a loss in his final season in Louisville, teams worried he was too short to win against these massive 6'6" NFL offensive tackles. And even the Broncos, the team who drafted him, had doubts because Shanahan lined him up at defensive tackle instead of defensive end to start his first season. And he's thinking that he could win against guards. But then Shanahan realized why Elvis was such a great pass rusher, even with his diminutive height. Now, even though he was 5'11", which is much shorter than the standard at edge rusher, his arms were as long as those of a much taller person. In fact, his arms are longer than the number 2 overall pick in this draft, Aiden Hutchinson, who stands 6'7". So the leverage from his shorter height and long arms really created nightmares for offensive tackles when he finally got a shot to rush from the edge in the NFL. In his first full season at edge rusher, he had 12.5 sacks, and he finished his career with 105.5 sacks, which was enough to lead all Broncos at the time of his retirement. But unfortunately, he finished his career with the Broncos with only 63.5 sacks due to the fax machine fiasco. So what happened? In 2013, the Broncos front office wanted to renegotiate Dumervil's contract to lower his base salary so they could get some salary cap relief. And negotiations stalled until the day of the deadline, like it often happens. And in a situation like this, when the deadline is up without a contract, the team is forced to make a decision. Take the cap hit or cut the player. And this fateful day, the deadline was at 4 p.m. and negotiations had went on most of the day. And the options were for Elvis to accept the contract, sign and return it via fax machine, which is the league mandated method of returning signed contracts when players are at a distance. Or the other option was to cut Elvis so the Broncos wouldn't take the cap hit. So 35 minutes before 4 p.m., Dumervil agreed to the new contract. But the problem was his agent was in Philly and he was in Miami. He needed to find a fax machine and do it quickly. So he set out looking for a Kinko's. Now, anyone who attended high school in the 90s or earlier knew about Kinko's. There were more than 850 stores across the United States in the late 90s, and everyone, I mean everyone, at that time knew it was the go-to place for copies, printouts, and, of course, fax machines. The problem was it was 2013, not 1998. Kinko's had been purchased by FedEx in 2004, and by 2008, there were no Kinko's left in the United States. All the stores were rebranded to FedEx Office. So Dumervil was looking for something that no longer existed. And when he finally found a fax machine, the fax of his signed contract arrived 6 minutes late. 6 minutes kept him from remaining a Bronco. The Broncos' hands were tied. They cut the star pass rusher at the deadline, and he went on to sign with the Baltimore Ravens, and he had a lengthy and prosperous career outside the Mile High City. Had he known that there were no longer Kinko's in existence, he may have saved himself those 6 minutes and retired as the Broncos sack leader and won a Super Bowl. Instead, his fax incident is the butt of many free agency jokes for nearly a decade. And that is your Mile High legend,